They said the Arizona Territory in 1885 was no place for a heart full of mercy. They said that when the drums stopped beating, the killing would start. But history forgot the night the canyon didn't burn with war. It burned with gratitude. This isn't a legend. It's the true account of Alara Vance, a 19-year-old outcast who risked being branded a traitor to save a life that the world told her to hate. When the Navajo warriors rode down from the mesa, they didn't bring arrows. They brought fire to light the dark, all for the daughter of their enemy. This is the story of the frontier girl and the silent pact. The heat in the Arizona Territory didn't just sit on you. It pressed down like a heavy, hot iron, trying to smooth out the wrinkles of the earth and anyone foolish enough to walk on it. For Alara Vance, the heat was the only constant companion she could trust. At 19, Alara was widely considered a spinster by the standards of Red Rock Creek, a dust-choked settlement sitting precariously on the edge of the Navajo Nation's borders. She was tall, with hands calloused from barbed wire and a face that refused to lower its gaze when the men in town spoke. Her father, Silas Vance, was a man carved from granite and bitterness, a cattle rancher who hated two things above all else: the wolves that took his calves and the savages, as he called them, who lived beyond the ridge. It was a Tuesday in late August, the kind of day where the air shimmered violently off the ground. Alara was riding the southern fence line of the Vance property, a treacherous stretch of land bordering the jagged fissure known locally as the Devil's Throat. It was a canyon so steep and sudden that cattle often wandered over the edge, vanishing into the deep red gloom below. Alara pulled on the reins of her mare, Bess, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirty sleeve. She was checking for breaks in the wire. Silas had been in a foul mood for weeks, convinced that Navajo raiders were cutting the fences to steal stock. Alara knew better. The wire was old and rusted, snapping under its own tension, but telling Silas that was like talking to a thunderstorm. She was about to turn back when she heard it. It wasn't the howl of a coyote, nor the scream of a hawk. It was a sound that triggered a primal instinct buried deep in her chest, a whimper. Alara froze. "Whoa, Bess," she whispered. The wind whistled through the sagebrush. Silence returned. Then it came again, a low, ragged sob echoing up from the lip of the Devil's Throat. Against her better judgment, Alara dismounted. She tied Bess to a scrub oak and crept toward the canyon's edge. The drop was nearly 200 feet, but about 20 feet down, there was a narrow limestone shelf, barely wide enough for a goat. Alara peered over, her stomach lurching. There, huddled against the canyon wall on that precarious ledge, was a bundle of color. It wasn't a calf. It was a child. He couldn't have been more than 3 years old. He was dressed in a tunic of woven wool, dyed with indigo and sumac, unmistakably Navajo. One of his legs was twisted at a sickening angle, and his forehead was matted with dried blood. He wasn't moving much, just emitting that soft, terrifying whimpering sound. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. If she rode back to town for help, 2 things would happen. First, the boy might fall before she returned. Second, if she brought the men from Red Rock Creek, specifically Sheriff Thorne or her father, they wouldn't see a child. They would see a pawn, or worse, a future enemy. "Hey!" she called out, her voice cracking. "Hold on!" The boy looked up. Even from this distance, she saw eyes wide with the terrifying silent shock of trauma. Alara looked at the rope coiled on her saddle. She looked at the sun, beginning its descent. She was alone. "Don't be a fool, Ilara," she muttered to herself, channeling her father's voice. "Leave it. It ain't your war." But the boy shifted, gravel cascading off the ledge into the abyss below. He screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that shattered her hesitation. Ilara grabbed the rope. She knotted it around the scrub oak, testing the roots. They held. She tied the other end around her waist. She didn't think about the politics of the territory. She didn't think about the peace treaty that was hanging by a thread. She only thought about the terrified eyes looking up at her. She went over the edge. The descent was a nightmare. The shale crumbled under her boots, sending showers of rock onto the boy, who curled into a ball to protect himself. Ilara slipped once, her shoulder slamming into the rock face, skin tearing through her shirt. She bit her tongue to keep from screaming, tasting copper. When her boots finally touched the ledge, the boy scrambled back, pressing himself into the rock. He was trembling so violently his teeth chattered, despite the heat. "It's okay," Ilara whispered, holding out her hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." She knew he didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She inched closer. The smell of him was distinct. Sage, smoke, and terror. She saw the injury on his leg. It was broken. Badly. "I've got you," she murmured. She unhooked the rope from her waist. This was the dangerous part. She had to tie him to her back. As she reached for him, the boy lunged, sinking his small teeth into her forearm. Ilara gasped, but didn't pull away. She let him bite, let him vent his fear, until his jaw slackened and he began to sob. "I know," she soothed, wrapping the rope around his small torso and securing him to her chest, swaddled in her duster coat. "I know it hurts." The climb back up was a blur of agony. With the extra weight, the rope bit into her hands. Her boots scrabbled for purchase. Twice she thought the scrub oak would give way, sending them both to their deaths. But when she finally hauled her body over the rim and collapsed onto the flat earth, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. She lay there panting, the boy unconscious against her chest. She had saved him. But as she looked toward the horizon, toward the distant mesas of the Navajo territory, she realized the real danger had just begun. She had an enemy child on her father's land, and the sun was going down. Night fell rapidly, bringing a chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Ilara rode Bess slowly, the horse sensing the extra burden and the tension in her rider. The boy, whom she had mentally named Little Hawk, for the way he had watched her from the ledge, was burning up with fever. She couldn't take him to the main house. Silas Vance was sitting on the porch right now, cleaning his Winchester, waiting for her report on the fences. If he saw the boy, he would demand the sheriff be called. They would use the child as leverage to renegotiate water rights with the tribe, or they would simply dump him at the reservation border, injured and dying, as a warning. Ilara skirted the main barn, heading for the old root cellar near the abandoned homestead on the far edge of their property. It was a relic from when her grandfather first settled the land, half buried in the earth, smelling of damp soil and potatoes. She dismounted in the shadows, carrying the boy inside. She laid him on a pile of empty burlap sacks. He moaned, his small hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. "I have to get water," she whispered into the dark, "and willow bark for the pain. I'll be back." She secured the heavy wooden door and ran back to the main house. "You're late," Silas growled from the porch rocker. The tip of his cigar glowed like a demon's eye in the dark. Wire was down near the wash, Ilara lied, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Had to splice it. Silas spat into the dust. Any sign of them? No, sir. Just coyotes. Keep your rifle close, Ilara. The air feels thick. Something's coming. I can feel it in my knee. Ilara nodded, rushing past him into the kitchen. She moved with the efficiency of a thief. A jar of water, strips of clean linen, a bottle of laudanum from the medicine cabinet, and a handful of dried jerky. She hid them in her apron. "Where are you going now?" Silas asked as she came back out. "Forgot to latch the grain bin in the lower barn," she said. "Don't want the rats getting in." Silas grunted, seemingly satisfied. "Don't take long. Supper's cold." Ilara returned to the cellar, her hands shaking as she lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. In the dim light, the boy looked worse. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. She cleaned the wound on his head, which luckily was just a gash, but his leg was swollen and hot to the touch. She had set bones on calves before, but never on a human, certainly never on a toddler. She soaked a rag in laudanum and water, pressing it to his lips. He drank instinctively. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. She used 2 pieces of kindling as splints. When she pulled the bone into alignment, the boy let out a shriek that she immediately smothered with her hand, pressing his face into her shoulder. He passed out from the pain. Ilara sat back, trembling. She wrapped the leg tight. She stayed with him for hours, listening to the wind howl outside. Every creak of the old wood sounded like her father's boots. Around midnight, the boy woke up. The fever seemed to have broken slightly. He looked at her, his dark eyes lucid. He reached up and touched the lock of blonde hair falling over her face. "Shema," he whispered. Ilara didn't know the word, but the softness of it broke her heart. It meant mother. Suddenly the sound of galloping hooves thundered past the cellar, heading toward the main house. Ilara extinguished the lantern instantly. She pressed her eye to the crack in the wooden door. 3 men on horseback. She recognized the silhouette of Sheriff Elias Thorne. He was shouting to her father. "Silas, get your gun!" Her father stepped off the porch. "What is it, Elias?" "Navajo raiding party," Thorne yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. "Spotted 'em crossing the ridge an hour ago. They ain't stealing cattle this time, Silas. They're riding hard, painted for war. They're looking for something." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. They weren't looking for something. They were looking for someone. "How many?" Silas asked, cocking his rifle. 50, maybe more. They're headed straight for the canyon pass. If they cross the creek, they'll be on your land in 20 minutes. Ilara looked back at the sleeping boy. His tribe was coming for him, but to get to him, they would have to burn through her father and the men of Red Rock Creek. A massacre was about to start, and the spark that lit the fuse was sleeping on a pile of burlap sacks at her feet. She had to make a choice. Hide him and let the men kill each other, or reveal him and risk being branded a traitor by her own blood. Ilara stood up. She grabbed her Winchester. She wasn't going to let them die. Not the boy. Not her father. Not the warriors coming for their son. She scooped the boy up, his weight heavy in her arms. "Hold on, little hawk," she whispered. "We're going for a ride." The darkness of the barn was thick, smelling of dry hay and old leather, but Ilara moved through it with the muscle memory of a lifetime spent in the saddle. Every second counted. Outside, the voices of her father and Sheriff Thorne were getting louder, their boots crunching on the gravel as they rallied the ranch hands. She could hear the metallic clack-clack of lever-action rifles being checked and loaded. Ilara laid the boy, Little Hawk, in the manger for a fleeting second to throw the saddle onto Bess. The mare nickered, sensing the frantic energy, but Ilara clamped a hand over the horse's velvet nose. "Quiet, girl," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We have to fly tonight. You hear me? We have to fly." She didn't light a lantern. She worked by touch, tightening the cinch with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She wrapped the boy back into the bundle on her chest, securing him with a complex knot of ropes usually reserved for hauling calves. He was hot against her sternum, his breathing shallow and rapid. Leading Bess to the back doors of the barn, which opened out toward the pasture and the creek beyond, Ilara paused. Through the cracks in the wood, she saw the flickering light of torches near the main house. More men were arriving, neighbors, summoned by the ringing of the iron triangle on the porch. They were forming a posse, a lynch mob. If she was caught now, Silas wouldn't just be angry. In his eyes, she would be aiding the enemy during an act of war. He might not shoot her, but he would surely tear the boy from her arms, and that would be a death sentence for the child. Ilara mounted up, swinging her leg over the saddle horn. She gritted her teeth, spurred Bess, and burst through the rear doors. The horse launched into a gallop instantly, her hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. "Hey, who goes there?" a voice shouted from the perimeter. It was dusty old Jed, one of the hands. A shot rang out, a warning shot fired into the air, but the crack of the pistol sent Bess into a panic. "Run, Bess!" Ilara screamed, leaning low over the mare's neck. They tore across the pasture, tearing through the sagebrush. Behind her, the shouting exploded into chaos. She heard Silas's voice, distinct and terrifying, cutting through the night. "That's my horse! Someone's stealing Bess! After them!" He didn't know it was her. He thought she was a horse thief. That meant they would shoot to kill. Ilara pushed the horse harder, aiming for the chaotic darkness of the creek bed that marked the boundary of their land. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. The boy against her chest let out a sharp cry as the horse jumped a fallen log, the jolt vibrating through his broken leg. I'm sorry," Ilara sobbed into the wind, tears streaming down her face. "Just a little longer." She wasn't running away from the danger. She was running directly into the throat of it. To save the boy, she had to reach the Navajo war party before her father did. She had to become the shield between two armies that wanted nothing more than to destroy each other. The terrain grew rougher. The moon was a sliver, offering barely enough light to see the treacherous footing. This was no man's land, a stretch of arroyos and sharp rocks. Suddenly, Bess skidded to a halt, rearing up. Ilara barely held on. Ahead of them, the horizon wasn't dark. It was glowing. Ilara froze. About a mile ahead, emerging from the shadows of the Devil's Throat, was a line of fire. Torches. Dozens of them. The Navajo weren't hiding. They weren't sneaking. They were riding in a wide phalanx, a wall of flame moving across the desert floor. The sound of their drums began to reach her, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the ground, syncing with the beating of her own heart. She looked back. Behind her, the lantern lights of the posse were cresting the ridge, moving fast. She was trapped, the hammer and the anvil. Ilara looked down at the boy. He was awake now, staring at the torches at the distance. He didn't cry. He reached a small hand out toward the lights. Hastian, he whispered. Ilara took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and impending death. She was 19 years old. She had never fired a gun in anger. She had never kissed a man. She had never left the territory. And tonight, she was going to die in the middle of a dry creek bed. No, she said, her voice hardening. Not tonight. She kicked Bess forward, not away from the torches, but directly toward the center of the Navajo line. She pulled the Winchester from its scabbard, not to shoot, but to signal. She held it high above her head, silhouetted against the stars. Hee-yah! She screamed, driving the horse into a dead sprint toward the wall of fire. The dry creek bed of the Red Rock Wash was wide, filled with white stones that glowed like bones in the moonlight. It was the unspoken border. To cross it was an act of aggression. Ilara hit the gravel of the wash just as the Navajo riders reached the opposite bank. The sight of them stopped the breath in her throat. There were at least 50 warriors, mounted on painted ponies that snorted and stomped. The men were terrifyingly magnificent. They wore buckskin and silver that caught the torchlight, their faces painted with the black and red of war. They carried rifles, lances, and bows. At the center sat a man on a massive Appaloosa. He wore a heavy silver necklace and a shirt of dark velvet. His face was a map of deep lines and hard eyes. This was a leader, a Nat-Ani. As Ilara scrambled up the bank onto their side, a dozen rifles leveled at her chest instantly. "Stop!" Ilara screamed, pulling Bess to a sliding halt. She dropped her own rifle to the ground, raising her empty hands high. The reins looped loosely around her wrist. The boy was hidden beneath her duster, a lump against her chest. The warriors shouted in Diné, their horses circling her aggressively. One young brave lunged forward, grabbing Bess's bridle, his knife drawn. "Wait!" Ilara yelled, looking directly at the leader. "I have him. I have the boy." The leader raised a hand. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with violence. He stared at her, his eyes dark pits of judgment. He didn't speak English, or he chose not to. Ilara's hands shook as she slowly, agonizingly slowly, undid the buttons of her duster. "Don't shoot," she whispered, more to herself than them. She pulled the coat open. The firelight hit the boy's face. Little Hawk blinked, shielding his eyes. A collective gasp went through the warriors. The sound of rifles being lowered was like the rustle of dry leaves. The leader's expression cracked. The mask of war fell away, replaced by the raw, agonizing relief of a father. He didn't wait. He slid from his horse with a grace that belied his age and rushed toward her. But before he could reach her, a gunshot shattered the night. The bullet struck the ground inches from the leader's boots, kicking up a spray of dirt. Ilara spun around in her saddle. On the opposite bank of the creek, her father, Silas Vance, sat atop his horse, smoke curling from the barrel of his Winchester. Behind him, Sheriff Thorne and 20 men from town fanned out, their weapons raised. "Get away from her, you savage!" Silas roared, his voice cracking with rage. "Ilara, get back here! Get away from them!" The truce was shattered. The Navajo warriors instantly raised their weapons again, arrows notched, rifles cocked. The leader, Hastian, didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, placing his body between the white men and Ilara. Ilara was directly in the crossfire. "Daddy, stop!" Ilara screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "You traitorous witch!" Silas shouted, his face purple in the torchlight. "You stole my horse to run off with them? After what they did to your uncle? I'll kill him. I'll kill every last one of them. He's a child, Silas, Alara yelled back, her fear mutating into a white-hot anger. Look, it's a baby. She turned Bess sideways so both sides could see the bundle in her arms. I found him in the devil's throat. He fell. I didn't run off to join them. I rode out to stop you from starting a war over a lost baby. Sheriff Thorne lowered his gun slightly, squinting. Silas, hold on. That is a child. I don't care, Silas spat. They're on my land. They crossed the creek. They crossed because they are looking for his son. Alara pointed at the Navajo leader standing near her stirrup. Look at him, Daddy. Look at his face. He's not a general right now. He's a father, just like you. The air hung suspended. It was the most dangerous moment Alara had ever known. One twitch of a finger, one spooked horse, and the creek would run red with blood. She was the only thing holding the dam back. The Navajo leader looked up at Alara. He saw the tears on her face. He saw the protective way she clutched his son. He looked across the creek at the angry white man who wanted him dead. Then the leader did something impossible. He turned his back on Silas Vance. He reached up with both hands toward Alara. It was a gesture of total surrender, of total trust. He was exposing his undefended back to a man with a loaded rifle to hold his child. Alara began to weep. She leaned down, unbuckling the straps. She carefully lowered Little Hawk into the leader's arms. The man took the boy, burying his face in the child's small neck. The boy wrapped his arms around his father's head, sobbing, Shijay, Father. The leader said something soft in Diné to the boy, then looked up at Alara. He didn't smile, but his eyes burned with a fierce, terrifying gratitude. He touched Alara's boot, a warrior's salute. Alara, get over here, now, Silas barked, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Alara straightened up. She looked at her father across the divide. She felt different. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire of the moment. No, she said clearly. What did you say to me? Silas whispered. I said no. I'm not riding back with you. Not while you're pointing a gun at a man holding his injured son. Alara turned her horse to face the Navajo warriors. I'm going to help them splint this leg properly. And if you shoot, Daddy, you're going to have to shoot through me. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshots. Sheriff Thorne slowly holstered his pistol. He looked at the men around him. Put 'em down, boys, he commanded quietly. There ain't going to be no fight tonight. Elias, Silas protested. It's done, Silas, Thorne said, his voice hard. Look at your girl. She's got more grit than the lot of us combined. Go home. One by one, the ranchers lowered their rifles. They looked at the scene. The young woman, the warrior, the child, and the anger drained out of them, replaced by a confusing mixture of shame and awe. Silas Vance sat alone on his horse, his weapon still half raised. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He didn't see the spinster who fixed fences. He saw something formidable. He lowered his rifle slowly, turned his horse, and rode away into the darkness without a word. But the story didn't end there. As the posse retreated, Alara realized she was still surrounded by 50 armed warriors on the wrong side of the creek. The leader handed his son to a rider next to him. He turned to Alara. He spoke in broken, heavy English, the words feeling like stones dropping into a well. You saved life. He fell, Alara said, her voice trembling again. I just caught him. The leader nodded. He looked at the sky, then at the canyon walls. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to her. It was a turquoise necklace, heavy and old, the stones the color of the midday sky. "Fire," he said, pointing to the cliffs of the canyon. "Watch fire." Ilara didn't understand what he meant, but she took the necklace. The warriors turned and rode back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as they had come, leaving Ilara alone in the wash, the moonlight reflecting off the white stones. She thought it was over. She thought she had survived the night, but the next night, the real miracle began. Ilara didn't return to the ranch house that night. She slept in the barn with Bess, the adrenaline crash leaving her shaking and cold despite the summer heat. When she finally walked into the kitchen the next morning, the silence was suffocating. Silas Vance sat at the table, nursing a black coffee. He didn't look up. He didn't yell. He simply pushed a plate of cold biscuits toward her, a silent, grudging peace offering. Life in Red Rock Creek resumed its gritty rhythm, but everything had changed. The townspeople whispered when Ilara walked by. Some called her Indian lover, spitting in the dust near her boots. Others, the women mostly, looked at her with a strange, guarded respect. She had stared down a war party and her own father in the same hour. That wasn't something easily forgotten. But the true shift happened 3 nights later. Ilara was sitting on the porch, mending a tear in her duster, when the sky to the south began to glow. "Silas!" she called out, fear spiking in her chest. "Fire!" Her father burst out the screen door, rifle in hand, expecting a raid. But as they watched, the light didn't move. It didn't crackle with the chaos of burning buildings. It was steady. They walked out to the fence line. There, high up on the rim of the Devil's Throat Canyon, miles of jagged rock that acted as the natural border, lights were flickering. Not one, not 10, hundreds. The Navajo had lit fires along the entire ridgeline. "What are they doing?" Silas muttered, squinting. "Signaling an attack?" Ilara watched the flames dancing in the dark. They weren't erratic. They were spaced evenly, forming a massive, glowing crescent that seemed to embrace the valley floor where the Vance Ranch lay. "No," Ilara whispered, clutching the turquoise necklace she now wore, hidden beneath her shirt. "They aren't signaling an attack. They're watching." For 7 nights, the fires burned. Every night at dusk, the rim of the canyon lit up like a crown of stars. It unnerved the town. Sheriff Thorne rode out to the reservation border to demand an explanation from the Indian agent, a government man named Miller. Miller came back 2 days later, looking pale and bewildered. He sat in the saloon, wiping dust from his glasses as the town men gathered around. "I spoke to Haston Begay," Miller said, using the leader's name, a name Ilara finally learned. "I told him the fires were scaring the settlers. I told him to put them out." "And?" Silas demanded. "He told me to go to hell," Miller said flatly. "He said the fires aren't for us. He said, well, it sounds crazy." "Spit it out, Miller," Thorne growled. "He said the fires are the eyes of the ancestors. He said, as long as the girl of the white stone, that's what he calls you, Ilara, lives on this land, the shadows will not touch her. The fires are a vigil, an honor guard." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Ilara, who was standing in the back, buying flour. "They're guarding her?" Silas asked, his voice hollow. "They think she's blessed," Miller shrugged. "Haston Begay said his son would be dead if not for her. He said the fires will burn until the debt is paid." The fires eventually stopped after the seventh night, but the message was received. Elara Vance was untouchable. No cattle rustler, no outlaw, and certainly no local drunk dared to cross the Vance property line. The ranch, previously struggling against theft and predation, suddenly became the safest land in the territory. The wolves stopped taking calves. The fences remained uncut. It was as if an invisible dome of protection had been placed over them. But the Old West was a cruel place, and debts were often paid in ways no one expected. 2 years passed. The year 1887 brought a winter so vicious the elders claimed the sun had died. The blizzards howled down from the north, burying the Arizona territory in 10 feet of snow. Red Rock Creek was decimated. The supply trains from the east couldn't get through the passes. The general store shelves went bare in January. By February, families were boiling leather boots for soup. The Vance Ranch was hit hard. Silas, older and frailer now, caught pneumonia. He lay in the back bedroom, his breathing rattling like dry leaves. Elara was exhausted. She spent her days chopping wood until her hands bled and digging tunnels through the snow to feed the few surviving cattle. They were down to their last sack of cornmeal. "Elara," Silas rasped one evening, the fever high in his eyes. "Don't let me die hungry, girl." "I won't, Daddy," she lied, smoothing his hair. She knew they had perhaps 3 days of food left. Outside, the wind screamed. Elara went to the window, looking out at the white expanse of death. She touched the turquoise necklace at her throat. She hadn't seen Hastien Begay or Little Hawk since that night at the creek. The tribe had moved deeper into the mesas for the winter. They were likely starving too. The government rations were notoriously scarce and rot-filled. On the third morning of the blizzard, Elara heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Thumping. Heavy, rhythmic thumping on the roof of the porch. Bears. Wolves. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands shaking from hunger and cold. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open against a drift of snow. There was nothing on the porch, but in the yard, barely visible through the swirling white, were shapes. Dark shapes retreating into the tree line. Elara stepped out, the snow crunching under her boots. She looked down. There, piled on the porch steps, was a mountain of meat. Freshly dressed venison, a dozen wild turkeys, sacks of piñon nuts, and wrapped in a distinct woven blanket, a clay pot filled with honeycomb. It was enough food to feed them for months. Elara dropped to her knees in the snow. She saw the tracks leading away, moccasin prints rapidly filling with snow. They had come down from the high country, braving the blizzard, walking miles through the deadly drifts to deliver food to the girl of the white stone. She found a small strip of leather tied to the leg of the largest buck. Burned into the leather was a crude drawing. A hawk with a broken wing, now flying. Elara dragged the food inside, weeping. She made a broth of the venison and fed it to her father spoon by spoon. "Where did you get this?" Silas asked, color returning to his cheeks as he ate. "Did Thorn make it through with a wagon?" "No, Daddy," Elara said softly. "It wasn't Thorn." Silas stopped eating. He looked at the dark meat, then at his daughter. The realization washed over him. The people he had hated, the people he had called savages, had just saved his life while his own government let them starve. Silas Vance never spoke a bad word about the Navajo again. But the twist, the cruel, twisting knife of reality, was yet to come. The winter passed, and spring brought the thaw. The Vance Ranch flourished, bolstered by the strange alliance. But in the town of Red Rock Creek, resentment was brewing. A new man had come to town, a land speculator named Marcus Thorne, cousin to the sheriff, but with none of the man's morals. Marcus represented a mining conglomerate from the east. They had found copper in the Devil's Throat Canyon. Marcus wanted the land. Specifically, he wanted the Vance land, which controlled the access to the canyon rim, and he wanted the Navajo removed from the valley below to make way for blasting. He approached Silas first with money. Silas, loyal to the unspoken pact, refused. "I ain't selling, and I ain't letting you blast that canyon. There's history there." Marcus Thorne smiled, a cold, serpentine smile. "History doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Vance, but tragedy changes ownership." Marcus didn't target Silas. He knew the old man was stubborn. He targeted the link between the ranch and the tribe. He targeted Ilara, but he couldn't hurt her. Everyone knew about the protection. If he touched Ilara, the Navajo would burn the town to the ground. So, Marcus devised a lie so poisonous it would turn the protectors into the executioners. One afternoon in May, Ilara was in town picking up supplies. Marcus staged a scene. He hired 2 drifters to claim they saw Ilara selling Navajo scouting locations to the U.S. cavalry. He planted false maps in her saddlebags. Rumors fly faster than bullets. Within a week, the whisper had reached the reservation. The girl of the white stone is a spy. She saved the boy only to learn the tribe's secrets. She is the reason the soldiers found the winter camp. It wasn't true. The soldiers hadn't found the camp, but fear makes men blind. Ilara noticed the change immediately. The feeling of safety evaporated. When she rode near the ridges, she felt eyes on her, not protective, but predatory. The fires in the canyon didn't return, but the smoke signals did, sharp and jagged warnings. Then, Bess went missing. Ilara found the mare the next morning, wandering near the creek. Her mane had been sheared off, a Navajo mark of shame. "They turned on us," Silas said, loading his rifle with trembling hands. "I told you, Ilara, in the end, they always turn." "No," Ilara insisted, though her stomach churned. "Someone is lying to them. I have to talk to Hasti and Begay." "You go out there now. They'll kill you," Silas warned. "If I don't, they'll kill us all anyway," Ilara said. "I need to go to the canyon." She rode out alone at sunset. She didn't take a gun. She wore the turquoise necklace openly. She rode to the spot where she had found Little Hawk years ago. "Hastian!" she screamed into the void. "Hastian Begay! Come out!" The wind answered. Then, the click of a rifle hammer. Ilara turned. Standing 10 feet away wasn't Hastian. It was a young warrior she didn't recognize. His eyes were full of hate. He raised his rifle, aiming at her heart. "Traitor," he spat in English. Ilara closed her eyes. She had saved a life here. Now, it seemed, she would give hers back. Bang! The gun went off. Ilara flinched, waiting for the pain. It didn't come. She opened her eyes. The young warrior was staring down at his chest, where a red blossom was spreading. He crumpled to the ground. Behind him, emerging from the shadows of the rocks, stood Marcus Thorne, a smoking pistol in his hand. "You?" Ilara gasped. "Can't have them killing you, my dear." Marcus smiled, walking closer. "That would end the conflict too quickly. I need a war. A big one. One that clears out the Indians and your father." He pointed the gun at her. "You see," Marcus explained calmly, "if I kill you here and leave this dead brave next to you, it looks like a mutual kill. The town will rise up to avenge their white flower. The tribe will rise up to avenge their warrior. The army will come in to crush the rebellion. And when the dust settles, I get the copper." Ilara stared at him. It was the cold logic of sociopathy. "Goodbye, Miss Vance," Marcus said. He cocked the hammer. Thwack. A sound like a melon being dropped. Marcus Thorne's eyes went wide. He looked down. An arrow was protruding from his chest, the fletching vibrating with the force of the impact. He dropped to his knees, gasping, the gun falling from his hand. Ilara spun around toward the canyon rim. Standing on the very ledge where the toddler had fallen years ago, silhouetted against the rising moon, was a figure. Not a child anymore. A boy of 7 or 8. And beside him, the tall, imposing figure of Hastin Begay, holding a longbow. Little Hawk had remembered. The echo of the arrow striking Marcus Thorne seemed to hang in the canyon air longer than the gunshot. Ilara stood frozen, her chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nose. The young Navajo warrior lay dead in the dust, a pawn in a game he never understood. Marcus Thorne lay a few yards away, the fletching of the arrow in his chest still vibrating like the wing of a dying bird. Ilara turned slowly toward the rim. The figure standing there was silhouetted against the rising moon, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a longbow made of ash and sinew. Beside him stood a smaller shape. Hastin Begay and Little Hawk began the descent. They moved down the treacherous switchbacks, not with the haste of rescuers, but with the solemn, terrifying pace of judges. When they reached the canyon floor, Hastin didn't look at the dead warrior. He didn't look at the corpse of the man who had tried to orchestrate a massacre. He looked only at Ilara. He walked up to her, his face a mask of leather and stone. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had saved his son, yes, but she was also the daughter of the enemy, and a Navajo brave lay dead at her feet. Hastin reached out a weathered hand. He touched the turquoise necklace hanging at her throat. For a terrifying second, Ilara thought he was going to rip it away, to revoke the protection and leave her to the wolves. Instead, he centered the stone, his thumb brushing the dust from the blue gem. "Why?" Ilara whispered, her voice trembling as the adrenaline crashed. "The rumors? They said I was a traitor. They said I sold you to the cavalry." Hastin turned his gaze to the body of Marcus Thorne. "The coyote weaves many traps," he said, his English slow and heavy, like stones dropping into deep water. "This man came to our fires. He showed us papers. He showed us maps with your name on them. He told the young men that the girl of the white stone was a spy." Ilara felt the sting of tears. "And you believed him?" Little Hawk stepped forward. He was 7 years old now, his eyes sharp and intelligent, no longer the terrified toddler she had strapped to her chest. He looked at the dead warrior, then up at Ilara. "Some believed," the boy said, his voice clear. He pointed to the dead brave. "He let anger blind his eyes. He came to kill." "And you?" Ilara asked Hastin. "Did you come to kill me too?" Hastin shook his head slowly. "I came to watch. I remembered the fire. I remembered the woman who jumped into the devil's throat when no one else would." He stepped closer, towering over her. "A traitor does not ride into an ambush unarmed, Ilara Vance. A traitor does not wear the stone of the ancestors while facing a rifle. You came here to die to save us. That is not the act of a spy." He gestured to Thorne's body. "He wanted us to kill you. He wanted the white soldiers to come and wipe us out so he could dig the earth for metal. He did not know that the canyon has eyes." The cleanup was grim. They wrapped the young warrior in a blanket, chanting a low, mournful song that made the hair on Alara's arms stand up. But for Marcus Thorne, there was no song. "We will take him back," Alara said, her voice hardening into steel. "The town needs to see this." They loaded Thorne's body onto his horse. Hastian mounted his Appaloosa. Alara mounted Bess. "You do not have to ride with me," Alara said to the chief. "If you ride into Red Rock Creek, they might shoot." Hastian looked at her, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. "Let them look. Today, we ride as one." It was a sight that would pass into the legend of the Arizona Territory. As the sun broke over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet, they rode into town. The spinster rancher and the Navajo chief, side by side. Behind them, the slumped body of the land speculator. The town was waking up. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping. The saloon doors swung open. Silence rippled through the street, faster than any shout. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Elias Thorne, Marcus's cousin, stumbled out, buttoning his suspenders, his eyes widening as he saw the procession. Alara dismounted. She untied the ropes and let Marcus's body slide into the dust with a heavy thud. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the forged maps she had found on Marcus's person, the ones he had planted and the ones Hastian had retrieved. She threw them at the sheriff's feet. "He tried to start a war, Elias," Alara announced, her voice ringing off the wooden storefronts. "He hired men to lie. He killed a young brave. He tried to kill me. And he did it all for a hole in the ground." Elias Thorne looked down at the arrow protruding from his cousin's chest. He looked at the maps. He looked up at the ridge surrounding the town. Lining the cliffs, silent as statues, were 50 Navajo warriors. They weren't attacking. They were witnessing. Elias took off his hat. He looked at Hastian Begay, locking eyes with the man he had been told to hate. He saw no malice there, only a fierce, terrifying dignity. "Justice has been done," Elias said quietly, his voice hoarse. He kicked the dirt near his cousin's boot. "Bury him outside the fence line. We don't want his kind resting with decent folk." Hastian nodded once. He turned his horse. He didn't say goodbye to Alara. He simply raised a fist to his chest, the sign of the blood bond, and rode back toward the rising sun. The warriors on the ridge vanished as if they were made of smoke. The war never happened. The copper mine was never dug. The devil's throat remained silent, save for the wind and the hawks. The long peace. The years that followed were kind to the Vance Ranch, though the world changed around them. The railroad finally came through, bringing automobiles and telegraph poles, shrinking the wild frontier. Silas Vance lived another 5 years. The hate that had poisoned his heart for decades had been drawn out like venom. In his final years, he would often sit on the porch, watching the southern horizon. When the winter snows came, he insisted on leaving bales of hay at the canyon edge for the tribe's horses. When Silas died, he didn't just have the townspeople at his funeral. A delegation of Navajo elders stood at the back of the church, silent and respectful. They didn't enter the pews, but they chanted a low song as his coffin was lowered, a song for a man who had learned, at the very end, to see. Alara never married. The town gossips said she was too hard, too independent. But the truth was simpler. She had a family that no one else understood. She ran the ranch alone, becoming one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But every Sunday, without fail, a rider would appear on the southern ridge. It was Little Hawk. As the years passed, the boy became a man. He learned to speak English with Ilara's cadence. She learned the complex tonal beauty of Diné. They would sit on the porch for hours, drinking coffee, two souls from different worlds bridged by a rope and a memory. He told her of his wife, his children. He asked for her advice on cattle. She asked for his wisdom on the drought. They were bound not by blood, but by the fire of that one terrifying night. The final fire. The true end of the story, the moment that cemented the legend, happened 40 years later, in the winter of 1925. Ilara Vance died in her sleep during a snowstorm at the age of 59. Her heart, worn out by a lifetime of hard labor and high altitude, simply stopped. The town of Red Rock Creek prepared a funeral. The mayor planned a speech. The new sheriff polished his badge. They treated her as a founding mother of the town. But as the sun went down on the day of her death, the townspeople stopped their preparations. A murmur went through the crowd gathered at the cemetery. They pointed to the south. The devil's throat was glowing. For the first time in 4 decades, the fires were lit. But this was not the small crescent of her youth. This was an inferno of gratitude. The fires stretched for miles, lining the jagged rim of the canyon, extending all the way to the dark mesas of the interior. It was said that every family in the Navajo Nation had lit a fire that night. The sky turned a deep throbbing orange, melting the snow on the peaks. As the hearse carried Ilara's body toward the grave, the sound of drums began. It wasn't a war drum. It was a heartbeat. A line of riders appeared from the darkness, flanking the hearse. They held torches high, the flames whipping in the wind. They were the honor guard, come to escort the girl of the white stone home. At the graveside, the townspeople stepped back, awestruck. A man in his 40s stepped forward. He walked with a slight permanent limp, the only reminder of a fall that had happened a lifetime ago. He wore a suit, but his hair was long and bound in the traditional style. It was Little Hawk. He approached the coffin. He didn't weep. He placed a hand on the wood, and then he laid a woven blanket over it, a blanket with the pattern of a hawk flying out of a canyon. He turned to the crowd. "She was not of our blood," Little Hawk said, his voice powerful and deep, carrying over the wind. "But she was of our spirit. The canyon took her fear, and she gave us her life. She stood between the arrow and the gun. She was the bridge." He looked up at the burning rim of the canyon. "As long as the wind blows through the devil's throat," he declared, "Ilara Vance will not be forgotten. Her fire will not go out." And it didn't. To this day, if you travel to that remote corner of Arizona, past the paved roads and the tourist stops, the locals will tell you a story. They won't tell you about the gunfights or the gold. They will tell you to watch the canyon rim on the anniversary of the Great Snow. Because sometimes, just for a second, when the light hits the red rock just right, you can see the phantom flicker of 1,000 fires, lighting the dark for the frontier girl who saved her enemy. Ilara Vance's story is a testament to the power of individual courage. In a world demanding she choose a side, she chose humanity. She defied her father, her community, and the violent prejudices of the 1880s, all to save a child who was supposed to be her enemy. In return, she didn't get a medal. She received an honor far greater, a circle of fire that burned through the darkness of hate, proving that gratitude has a longer memory than vengeance. It makes you wonder, if a 19-year-old girl in the harsh frontier could find the courage to cross the line, what lines are we afraid to cross today? If this true life drama moved you, Please honor Ilara's memory by hitting that like button. It helps us share these forgotten histories with the world. And here is a question for you. Do you think Silas Vance redeemed himself in the end? Or was it too little, too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. Until next time, keep the fire burning.